By the time the contract was terminated, the organization had been insolvent in operational terms for at least 8 months. The clients had stopped paying on schedule. The insurers had withdrawn war risk coverage on the primary operational theater. The senior personnel with the most marketable skills had already accepted positions elsewhere. What remained was a legal entity with a roster of contracts, a liability exposure it could not service, and a set of physical assets, vehicles, communications equipment, weapon systems held under license that were worth considerably less in a fire sale than they appeared on the balance sheet. The organization looked, from the outside, like a functioning private military company until the week it did not. This is the failure mode that the economics of private military contracting produces more consistently than any other outcome. And it is the outcome that the commercial structure of the industry is almost perfectly designed to obscure until it is too late to address. We ran the numbers on how this business is actually built, what it costs, what it generates, and why the gap between those two figures is almost always smaller than the people running the organization believe it is at any given moment. Private military contracting as a commercial industry has a documented history extending to the post-Cold War reorganization of security sector employment in the early 199 BOS, when the structural drawdown of Western military forces created a large pool of specialized personnel whose skills had no direct civilian application, but significant potential value to governments, corporations, and international organizations operating in high-risk environments. The Lloyd's of London market had been underwriting war risk on shipping and personnel since the 17th century. What changed in the 199s was the scale at which private organizations began systematically aggregating and reselling that specialized capability on a contract basis, and the degree to which that aggregation began to resemble, in financial terms, a conventional professional services firm. A private military company is never just a collection of former soldiers for hire. It is a professional services firm with a specialized labor input, an unusually complex liability structure, a client base whose payment reliability is inversely correlated with the operational environments in which they are most likely to need the services being sold, and a cost structure that does not scale predictably in either direction. We are going to examine why that structure consistently produces outcomes that are worse for the company providing the services than the contract terms suggest they should be, starting with the capital commitment required to be in the business at all. The entry cost for a credible private military company capable of tendering for significant government or multinational corporate contracts has been estimated by academic analysis of the sector, including work by Sean McFade at Georgetown University and James Cockayne at the UN University, at between $15 million and $50 million in initial capitalization, depending on the intended capability profile and the geographic focus of operations. This covers personnel recruitment and vetting, equipment procurement or lease, insurance underwriting, legal and compliance infrastructure, and the working capital required to operate through the gap between contract commencement and first payment receipt. The equipment component alone represents a capital commitment that most traditional professional services firms would not recognize. A company capable of providing convoy protection services in high-risk environments needs a fleet of armored vehicles, communication systems, weapons held under the appropriate national and international licenses, medical evacuation capability, and logistics support infrastructure. Armored light vehicles cost between $180,000 and $650,000 each depending on specification. A convoy protection capability of meaningful scale requires a minimum of 8 to 12 vehicles in operational rotation, with additional vehicles held in maintenance reserve. That is a capital investment of between $1.4 million and $7.8 million in vehicles alone, before any other equipment category is addressed. This is the capital structure problem of a specialized equipment leasing company, applied to assets that depreciate rapidly in operational conditions, cannot be easily redeployed to alternative uses if the contract is canceled, and whose resale value in the secondary market is subject to complex regulatory restrictions that the original purchase was not. Think of it as buying a fleet of specialized industrial machines for a single long-term client, where the machines are worth 30% of their purchase price if the client cancels the contract, and where the regulatory environment governing their disposal changes unpredictably based on political decisions you cannot control. Here is the insurance problem because it is the cost that most analyses of private military company economics substantially underestimate. War risk insurance for personnel operating in high risk environments is underwritten by a specialized market segment, historically centered in London, that prices coverage based on a combination of the specific theater of operations, the casualty history of similar operations in the same geography, and the specific activities being undertaken. Lloyd's syndicates that underwrite this category apply actuarial models that have been refined over decades of coverage for extractive industry operations, maritime security, and diplomatic protection services. The premium rates that result from this underwriting process are, by the standards of any other insurance category, extraordinary. War risk life and disability coverage for personnel operating in documented high risk environments runs between 3 and 12% of total insured value per year, depending on the specific operational profile. For a company with 200 personnel insured at an average of $500,000 per head, that is an annual insurance cost of between $3 million and $12 million before any property or liability coverage is added to the program. Comprehensive liability coverage for a company operating in an environment where civilian harm claims are a documented and persistent risk adds a further material cost that most companies in the sector carry incompletely or not at all, because the premium is commercially prohibitive against the margins the contracts generate. The practical result is a gap between the insurance coverage that the contract terms implicitly require the company to maintain and the coverage that the company can afford to purchase while remaining commercially viable. This gap is not a secret. It is a structural feature of the market that every experienced client procurement officer understands, and that creates a mutual pretense on both sides of the contract negotiation that is maintained until a claim event makes the gap undeniable. The contract structure is where the business model's structural fragility becomes most visible. A private military company contract for a defined operational service, escort protection, site security, training delivery, typically runs between 6 months and 3 years with a defined scope of services, a fixed daily or monthly rate, and payment terms that usually involve a mobilization advance against the first 30 to 60 days of contract value, followed by monthly payment in arrears. This payment structure creates an inherent working capital requirement. The company incurs costs from the first day of mobilization, but receives revenue on a schedule that lags actual cost incurrence by 30 to 60 days at minimum, and often significantly longer in practice. For a contract generating $3 million per month in revenue, with costs of $2.4 million per month, the working capital requirement to sustain operations through a 60-day payment lag is approximately $4.8 million in committed expenditure before the first payment arrives. A contract that experiences payment delays, which documented cases show is common across both government and corporate clients operating in high-risk environments, extends this working capital requirement by the full amount of each delayed payment. A company with $15 million in capitalization and 2 significant contracts experiencing simultaneous payment delays of 90 days is, functionally, operating at its capital limit before any unexpected operational cost is added. This is the project finance structure of a construction contractor, where revenue recognition lags cost incurrence by the length of the payment cycle. Applied to an industry where the unexpected costs are not cost overruns on concrete or steel, but casualty events, equipment damage, contract scope, changes driven by changes in the operational environment, and the full range of force majeure events that the contract language almost never adequately covers. The personnel cost structure deserves specific analysis because it is the largest single operating cost and the one most subject to rapid change in ways the company cannot control. Senior operational personnel in the private military sector, individuals with verifiable credentials, significant operational experience, and the interpersonal skills to manage complex multinational teams in high-stress environments command daily rates between $800 and $2,500 depending on specialization. A team of 20 senior personnel at an average of $1,000 or $200 per day generates a direct labor cost of $24,000 per day, or approximately $8.7 million per year for that subset of the workforce alone. Support personnel, drivers, local national employees, administrative and logistics staff add a further cost layer that typically runs between 40 and 60% of the senior personnel cost. The labor market for this specific talent pool is genuinely competitive because the skills are transferable across a small number of alternative employers, including other private military companies, government security agencies, and corporate security functions at major multinationals. This creates a retention problem that has no clean solution. Pay rates high enough to retain experienced personnel compress margin to the point where the contract is barely profitable. Pay rates calibrated to maintain margin create attrition to competitors, which forces replacement hiring and retraining costs that often exceed the savings from the lower rate. Pinkerton, which has operated as a private security and investigation firm continuously since 1850 and now functions as a corporate intelligence and security consultancy under Securitas ownership, solved a version of this problem in the 19th century through institutional brand differentiation. Pinkerton's reputation as a reliable, professional organization that delivered consistent service quality created a client willingness to pay a premium over alternatives, which funded the higher wages necessary to attract and retain the personnel that sustained the reputation. The model worked because the market for Pinkerton's services was stable enough, and the competitor landscape fragmented enough, that brand premium could be maintained over decades. The modern private military contracting market has neither condition in sufficient measure to make the same model reliable. Now look at the numbers that explain why this business consistently underperforms the contract revenue figures suggest it should. A composite operation running 3 active contracts worth a combined $8 million per month in gross revenue, with a fully loaded cost structure including personnel, equipment, insurance, legal and compliance, and overhead running at 78% of revenue, generates a net operating margin of 22% on paper. Against that 22%, the working capital cost of the payment lag structure consumes approximately 4 to 6 percentage points of margin annually. Insurance shortfalls, when a claim event occurs that falls within the gap between required and actual coverage, can consume the equivalent of 12 to 18 months of net margin in a single event. Personnel attrition to competitors during periods of market tightness adds replacement and retraining costs that typically run 2 to 4 percentage points of annual revenue. The realistic net margin after these structural costs that do not appear as line items in the initial contract negotiation runs between 3 and 11%, depending on the specific contract mix and the accident rate in the operational period. For comparison, a major management consulting firm operating in conventional commercial environments earns net margins of between 15 and 30% on a labor cost dominant business. The private military company earns lower margins than a conventional professional services firm, while bearing substantially higher liability exposure, substantially higher capital requirements, and a client payment reliability that is inversely correlated with the complexity of the environment in which the service is being delivered. This is the structural contradiction that makes the business model persistently fragile despite the genuine value of the services being provided. The environments where the services are most needed are the environments where payment is least reliable, where insurance costs are highest, where equipment damage rates are greatest, and where the force majeure events that void contract payment obligations are most likely to occur. The regulatory environment is the second structural constraint that the commercial logic of the business cannot overcome. Private military companies operate under a complex and inconsistently applied international regulatory framework that includes national licensing requirements in their countries of incorporation, export control regulations governing the international movement of personnel and equipment, and the provisions of international humanitarian law that apply to their personnel's conduct in operational environments. The Montreux Document, agreed in 2008 by 17 states and international organizations, established the framework under which participating states agreed to apply international humanitarian law to the activities of private military and security companies. Compliance with this framework requires a legal and compliance infrastructure that adds between 3 and 7% of revenue in fixed overhead for a company operating across multiple jurisdictions. The practical effect of this regulatory environment is that a private military company attempting to expand its geographic footprint faces a licensing and compliance cost that increases non-linearly with each additional jurisdiction entered. A company with operations in 3 countries and licensing in 2 of them faces a qualitatively different compliance burden than a company with a single country focus, and the cost of managing that burden comes out of the same margin that is already compressed by the structural factors described above. The failure mode that opened this analysis is not exceptional. It is the modal outcome for private military companies that expand beyond a single contract, single geography model, without the capital base to absorb the working capital requirements of multiple simultaneous contracts at different stages of their payment cycles. The organization that appeared functional until the week it did not was not a badly managed operation. It was an operation that was functioning within the structural constraints of a business model that produces this outcome with considerable regularity across a range of organizational qualities and management capabilities. The lesson embedded in this ledger is not about mercenaries. It is about what happens when a professional services business is built in an environment where every structural feature of the market, payment terms, insurance costs, labor market dynamics, regulatory complexity, pushes against the margin that the contract revenue appears to make available. The revenue is real. The margin between the revenue and the true cost of generating it is almost always smaller than the model suggests it should be, and the gap is reliably filled by the first significant event that the model did not price in correctly. The books close when the capital runs out. In this industry, that usually happens